It was supposed to be a weekend adventure, a brief escape from the monotony of daily life. Mike, Sarah, Josh, and Emily were all friends who had known each other since college. They had spent countless hours together talking about everything under the sun, but they had never experienced anything truly thrilling until now. As the summer heat slowly began to fade into the coolness of fall, the group decided they needed a change of pace, something wild, something unexpected. That's when Josh heard about the swamp. It had started innocently enough. Josh, always the one with his ear to the ground, had overheard a conversation at a party about the mysterious swamps of Florida. Apparently, there was an old lantern deep in the forest, hidden away for generations. According to the rumor, the lantern emitted a strange glow at night, and anyone who got too close would feel its cursed pull. The curse was said to drag people into the swamp forever, trapping them in its eerie, shadowy depths. The more Josh heard about it, the more fascinated he became. He brought it up casually to Mike and Sarah one evening. "Guys, what do you think about a weekend trip to Florida?" Josh said, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "I heard about this creepy swamp where there's an old lantern that glows at night. They say it's haunted, like cursed or something. It could be a fun adventure." Sarah, as always, was skeptical. "Cursed? You really believe in that kind of stuff, Josh?" Mike, the most adventurous of the group, leaned in with interest. "Come on, Sarah. It'll be fun. We'll just go see the lantern, take a few pictures, and head back. No harm in that. It sounds like something out of an old ghost story." Emily, who had always been the more practical one, was hesitant. "I'm not so sure about this. Swamps are dangerous. There could be snakes, quicksand, or worse. And what if there's something really out there?" Josh grinned, looking like he'd already made up his mind. "That's the point. It'll be a great story to tell when we get back." The group went back and forth, but eventually Sarah and Emily agreed to go along, knowing that it would be a fun, albeit slightly spooky, weekend getaway. So, on a Friday evening, they packed their bags with just enough supplies to last them the night. Flashlights, a few snacks, a couple of drinks, and some camping gear, just in case they ended up staying longer than planned. It wasn't going to be an expedition or anything serious, just a light-hearted adventure. As they piled into the car and drove toward the swamp, the excitement was palpable, a mixture of nervous energy and anticipation. The conversation in the car was filled with jokes about ghosts and curses, but beneath the laughter was a shared sense of wonder. No one truly believed the stories, at least not at first, but there was an undeniable thrill in the idea of stepping into something unknown. The drive took longer than expected. As they neared the swamp, the landscape around them changed. The roads became narrower, and the streetlights thinned out until the only illumination was the headlights of their car and the distant glow of the setting sun. The air grew thicker, almost as if it was alive. It was the kind of humidity that soaked right into your skin, making every breath feel heavy and sticky. The trees were so dense, they nearly formed a canopy over the road, blocking out what little light was left. The further they drove, the more isolated they became. When they finally parked at the edge of the swamp, it was already dusk, and the thick shadows of night were creeping in. They turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment, taking in the sounds around them. The air was filled with the croaks of frogs, the buzz of insects, and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush. The swamp, for all its beauty, had an eerie quality that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. It felt ancient, like something had lived here for centuries, something that had seen too many things to be disturbed by a few curious adventurers. "All right," Mike said, his voice breaking the silence. "We're here. Let's find this lantern." Josh, leading the way, pulled out a faded map he'd printed off the internet. "It says it's about a mile into the swamp, near an old oak tree. We should be—" Josh smiled reassuringly. "It's just a little walk. We'll be fine." They grabbed their gear and set off, their flashlights cutting through the growing darkness. The swamp, even during the evening, felt alive, almost suffocatingly so. Every step they took was met with resistance, as if the ground itself were trying to hold them back. The mud beneath their boots sucked at their feet with every movement, making the simple act of walking feel like a battle. The trees around them seemed to close in, casting long, dark shadows that flickered and swayed with the movement of the wind. The air was thick, pressing down on them as they trudged forward. As they ventured deeper into the swamp, the sound of croaking frogs became louder, almost deafening. The insects, too, were relentless, buzzing around them in clouds, sticking to their skin and clothes. The further they went, the more disorienting the swamp became. The landscape around them felt unreal, as if it were constantly shifting and changing. What had seemed like a straightforward path when they started now felt like a maze of twisted trees and muddy trails. Every step seemed to take them further from civilization, from the comfort of the world they knew. Sarah, still a little uneasy, kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone lurking in the distance. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" she asked, trying to sound casual, though there was a tremor in her voice. Josh, who was still leading the group, turned around with a grin. "Yeah, this is..." But as the minutes passed and the swamp seemed to close in on them even more, they began to question whether they had made a mistake. The path was barely visible now, and the moon had risen high enough in the sky to cast an eerie glow over the swamp. Their flashlights flickered every now and then, and every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves made them jump. It was hard to shake the feeling that something was watching them, that the swamp had begun to feel less like a place of exploration and more like a place of danger. "How much farther?" Emily asked, her voice tight with unease. "This place it's really creepy." Josh glanced down at the map again. "Just a few more steps, I think. The oak tree should be up ahead." But the more they walked, the more uncertain they became. The path seemed to grow narrower, and the trees seemed to crowd in closer. The swamp no longer felt like a mysterious adventure. It felt suffocating, like they were intruding on something ancient and forgotten. But still, they pressed on, driven by curiosity, excitement, and the lingering promise of a story to tell. And then, finally, they saw it. The oak tree. It wasn't the huge, majestic oak they had expected, but it was old, worn by time, with twisted roots that seemed to stretch out like hands. Beneath its gnarled branches lay something that should not have been there. A lantern. A black lantern, its glass cracked and worn, sitting silently in the middle of the clearing, glowing faintly in the darkness. The glow was not bright, far from it. It was a dull, sickly light, barely perceptible in the surrounding gloom. Josh approached it slowly, drawn to it despite the unease creeping into his chest. He reached out to touch the lantern, and the moment his fingers brushed its cold surface, the temperature around them dropped. The swamp, which had been alive with sound, suddenly fell into an unnatural silence. Even the insects seemed to stop moving. The air grew still, suffocating, and then it happened. A strange sound, low, guttural, and faint, came from deep within the swamp. It was a whisper, soft but distinct, like a voice calling out to them from the darkness. They froze, their breath. Josh stood still, his fingers still resting on the lantern. His face was pale, and he slowly turned to look at his friends. "I don't know, but we need to leave, now." But it was too late. The swamp was no longer just a place of mystery. It was a place of danger, and they had just awakened something that had been waiting for them all along. The midnight air was thick with a heavy, suffocating silence. The only sound that could be heard was the rhythmic crunching of their boots against the damp earth, each step growing slower as the group ventured deeper into the swamp. The path they had been following had almost disappeared, swallowed up by the growing shadows. What had once been a simple, albeit eerie, adventure was now starting to feel a little too real. The darkness seemed to close in around them, and with every passing minute, they grew more aware of how far they were from the safety of their car. The lights of civilization nowhere to be seen. It had been a little over an hour since they had set out to find the lantern, and they were beginning to doubt whether they had made the right decision. But then, as if in response to their uncertainty, they saw it. Just ahead, standing under the gnarled branches of an ancient oak, was the lantern. It was not as they had imagined. No one had prepared them for what it truly looked like. The lantern was old, almost impossibly old. Its black iron frame was covered in a thick layer of moss and vines that seemed to have grown through the cracks of time. It sat there, half hidden beneath the roots of the tree, as if waiting for them. The glass, cracked in several places, emitted a faint glow, almost like a sickly pulse. The light dull but unyielding, just bright enough to cast long, eerie shadows on the forest floor. The more they looked at it, the more out of place it seemed, as though it didn't belong in the swamp at all. The trees around them, the swamp, the night, all of it felt like it was waiting for this moment, waiting for them to find the lantern. "Hey, look at this," Josh said, his voice low, almost reverent. He didn't even hesitate as he stepped forward, reaching out for the lantern. Sarah, walking beside him, felt her stomach churn. She hadn't wanted to come here in the first place, and now, staring at the lantern, she felt that old, familiar unease settle deep in her chest. The darkness surrounding the lantern seemed to shift, its very presence unsettling. It wasn't just the way the glow flickered, nor was it simply how it looked. It was the feeling of something ancient, something powerful that surrounded it. A weight in the air, a stillness that felt wrong. "Josh, don't!" Sarah began, her voice trembling. But it was too late. Josh had already reached out and wrapped his fingers around the cold metal frame. As soon as his hand made contact, a strange, tingling sensation surged up his arm. The air around them, which had been heavy and oppressive, seemed to drop even lower in temperature. His breath fogged in front of him, and a chill spread across his skin like ice water running through his veins. The group froze, the hairs on the back of their necks rising in unison, as if some unseen force had whispered their names in the dark. "Josh, what the hell?" Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. He stepped forward, his flashlight trembling in his hand, the beam flickering like it was struggling to remain steady. A light from their flashlights seemed to dim, and the shadows around them grew deeper. Even the sounds of the swamp seemed to vanish, replaced by an unnerving silence. No croaks from the frogs, No chirps from the insects. Nothing. Only the cold breath of the wind, swirling around them, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and decay. The night had become still, unnaturally still. The atmosphere was thick with something else, something not of the world they knew. Josh looked up from the lantern, his face pale. He wasn't sure if it was the chill in the air or something more, but he felt a heavy pressure on his chest. It was like something was watching them. No, something was waiting. His eyes scanned the surroundings, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of life, just the lantern, its dull light flickering faintly in the darkness.
The others stood motionless, too afraid to speak, too afraid to move. Something in the air had changed, and they could feel it in their bones. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, more primal, a warning. "Do you feel that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. She was looking around, her eyes wide, her flashlight trembling in her grip. "Yeah," Mike said, his voice low. "I feel it too. Let's just take a picture and leave, okay? This doesn't feel right." Josh stood there for a moment longer, his hand still wrapped around the lantern. The cold was unbearable now. It wasn't just the chill of the night air. It was like the lantern itself was radiating something dark, something ancient. He glanced down at it again, and that's when he noticed the cracks in the glass. The faint glow flickered, as if trying to stay alive. But the longer he stared at it, the more it seemed to draw him in. "Yeah, let's go," Josh finally said, his voice strained. He didn't want to admit it, but the unease gnawing at his insides had grown into something worse. He slowly set the lantern back down onto the ground, but as his fingers left the cold metal, he felt an unnatural tug, like the lantern was trying to pull him back. They took a few steps away from it, but the air remained heavy. The silence had deepened, pressing in on them, smothering them, and then, without warning, the ground beneath their feet shifted slightly, and the lantern's glow intensified for a brief moment, just long enough to catch their attention. Emily gasped, her breath caught in her throat. "Did you see that?" Sarah's hand instinctively reached for her phone, but her fingers trembled so violently she could barely hold it. She took a quick photo, her heart racing. But the moment the camera clicked, the light from the lantern went out, plunging them into complete darkness. "Shit, I knew something was off," Sarah said, her voice tight. Her eyes darted nervously around the clearing, hoping to see something familiar in the blackness. But there was nothing. "Just stay calm," Mike said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Let's just get back to the car." Josh didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the spot where the lantern had been, his brow furrowed in confusion. The cold that had gripped him earlier had not faded. It had only grown worse, more suffocating. It was as though the swamp itself had become aware of their presence, a presence that had been lying dormant for centuries. Something was waiting. A soft rustling sound broke the silence, followed by a whisper, barely audible, but enough to send a chill through each of them. It wasn't the sound of wind. It wasn't the sound of any creature in the swamp. It was a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the air itself were speaking.
"You shouldn't have taken it," the voice whispered. Josh's heart skipped a beat. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. He turned to look at the others, but no one had heard it. No one had seen the change in the air. They were too busy trying to get away.
"Did you hear that?"
Josh whispered, his voice trembling.
"Hear what?"
Emily asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Josh couldn't explain it, couldn't make sense of it, but he knew what he had heard. The voice wasn't a trick of the wind or their imagination. It was real, and it had just warned them. Suddenly, the ground shifted again, more violently this time. The air grew even colder, and the darkness seemed to close in on them. The trees, which had seemed so distant, now loomed overhead like silent giants, their twisted branches scraping against each other in the wind. "Get back to the car," Sarah said, her voice rising in panic. Without another word, they turned and began to run, their feet slipping and sliding through the mud, their flashlights flickering wildly. But no matter how fast they ran, the swamp seemed to stretch on forever. The shadows of the trees merging with the night, hiding their way back. As they stumbled through the thick underbrush, the whisper returned, louder this time, a warning. But it was too late. Something had been awakened. Something that would not let them leave so easily. And somewhere, far in the distance, the lantern's glow flickered once more. The moment they decided to leave, things started to feel off. The swamp, which had once seemed so inviting and mysterious, had now turned hostile. The familiar path they had been following was gone, replaced by an overwhelming feeling of disorientation. Trees that had stood tall moments ago were now mere shadows in the distance. The air had thickened, like the swamp was closing in around them, and the once crisp sounds of nature, the croaks of frogs, the buzzing of insects, had all faded into an eerie silence. It felt as though the swamp itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Sarah's heart began to race, her breath shallow. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. The path they had taken seemed to have disappeared into the thick undergrowth, and they were left standing in the middle of the swamp with no clear direction. What had seemed like a straightforward walk out was now an endless stretch of dark, unfamiliar trees and creeping vines. The sense of dread was palpable, as though they were walking in circles without realizing it. "This isn't right," Sarah muttered under her breath, her voice trembling slightly. The words barely escaped her lips as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Her hands were shaking as she gripped her flashlight, its beam flickering with the damp air. She looked around, trying to find something familiar, but all she saw were dark silhouettes of trees, their twisted branches seeming to reach out like bony fingers clawing at the night sky. Mike, walking a few paces ahead, turned around and gave her a puzzled look.
"What do you mean?" he asked, his voice laced with confusion. We're just a little lost. That's all. We just need to..." His words were cut off as he stopped in his tracks, his flashlight now trained on something ahead of them. His eyes widened in disbelief. Emily and Sarah followed Mike's gaze, their hearts skipping a beat when they saw what he was staring at in the distance. Through the thick mist that had begun to form around them, a dim greenish light flickered. It wasn't the soft, flickering glow of the lantern Josh had carried earlier. No, this was different. This light hovered in the air, pulsating like a living thing. It was an unsettling shade of sickly green, glowing faintly through the fog, like the eyes of some monstrous creature lurking in the darkness. For a moment, the group stood frozen, staring at the strange light, unsure of what to do. The air around them had grown even colder, and the wind seemed to be picking up, howling through the trees, like a warning. The sounds of the swamp had disappeared entirely now, leaving only the rhythmic thumping of their own hearts in their ears. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. She turned toward the others, her eyes wide with fear. It sounded like a voice coming from everywhere. The others didn't respond immediately, too caught up in the strange phenomenon ahead of them. The light, which had been floating in midair, now seemed to grow brighter, intensifying with each passing second. The feeling of dread that had settled over them grew heavier, as if something was pulling them closer toward. Josh's hand tightened around the lantern he was still holding, the weight of it suddenly feeling much heavier than before. Maybe we should just keep moving. We're not far from the car. We can make it. But his voice lacked the usual confidence, and even he couldn't ignore the unease that had settled in his stomach. The swamp no longer felt like an adventure. It felt like a trap. The kind of trap where the walls close in around you and there's no way out. The light ahead of them flickered again, this time with a sudden burst of brightness, and then it was gone, replaced by an unsettling darkness. The silence that followed was unbearable. It was as though the entire swamp had fallen into a void. Even the wind had stopped, leaving them in a vacuum of quiet that made every small sound seem amplified. Sarah could feel her pulse in her ears as she shifted uneasily on her feet. It was as though time itself had slowed, each second stretching into eternity. Then, without warning, a low, guttural voice echoed through the trees. It wasn't like the sound of wind through the branches or the croaking of a frog. No, this was different. It was as if the voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding them, seeping into their minds. It didn't sound human, at least not entirely. It was deep, almost primal, like something ancient had been awakened. "Leave Now, the voice rasped, sending a chill down their spines. It didn't come from any one direction. It seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath their feet. The air around them grew colder, and the faint glow that had been ahead of them now seemed to pulse, almost as if responding to the voice.
"Did you hear that?" Emily gasped, her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes were wide with terror, and her body trembled as she looked toward Josh, as if looking for reassurance. But Josh had stopped breathing, his face pale as he turned toward the others. He didn't know how to explain it, but he could feel it, the presence that had just spoken. It wasn't just a voice, it was something deeper, something that filled the air with malice, something that knew them, watched them, and didn't want them there. Sarah was the first to react. "We need to go, now." Her voice was shaky, but there was a sense of urgency in it that made the others snap to attention. Mike, still frozen in place, looked at Sarah, then at Josh, who was gripping the lantern like it was the only thing anchoring him to the world. But it wasn't enough. They all felt it. Whatever it was getting closer, and they were too far from safety. "Move!" Mike shouted, his voice sharp. Without another word, they turned and began running, stumbling over roots and uneven ground, the weight of the swamp seeming to increase with every step. The flashlight beams flickered as they desperately tried to cut through the thick mist that seemed to have enveloped them. As they ran, the voice returned, louder this time, filling the air with its chilling echo. "You cannot leave. You belong to me now." The words sent a wave of terror crashing over them, and they ran faster, their breath ragged, the sound of their footsteps pounding in their ears. But no matter how fast they ran, the feeling of being pursued only grew stronger. The darkness seemed to stretch out before them, making it impossible to see where they were going. The path that had once been so clear now felt like a labyrinth, twisting and turning in on itself. In the distance, the faint light they had seen earlier flickered again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the soft glow from the lantern. This light was blinding, a sharp green flash that made their eyes burn. It seemed to be everywhere at once, surrounding them, blocking their escape. And then, for a moment, it disappeared. They kept running, pushing themselves harder, desperate to find their way out of the swamp. But as they ran, they realized the horrifying truth. The light wasn't just a light. It was a presence, something that had been waiting for them, something that had been calling to them. They had come too far now, and there was no turning back. They didn't know how much time had passed when they finally stopped, breathless and disoriented. The mist was thick around them, and the air was colder than it had ever been. There was no sign of the lantern, no sign of the eerie light. But there was something else, something far worse. The trees, which had once seemed like silent witnesses, now seemed to be closing in around them. The branches above them twisted and bent, and the shadows seemed to stretch toward them like fingers, reaching for their skin. And then, in the distance, they heard it. A soft, scraping sound, like metal against stone, dragging slowly through the underbrush. It was the lantern, but not the lantern they had seen before. This one was different. It was alive. It seemed to breathe, and its glow pulsed with a sickly green hue that filled the air with an oppressive, suffocating darkness. The voice, deep and guttural, returned, sending a cold shiver down their spines. You should never have come. The words reverberated through the air, echoing in their minds, filling them with dread. It was too late. The swamp had claimed them, and somewhere hidden in the darkness, the lantern watched. The light flickered again, but this time it grew brighter, intensifying with a force that seemed almost unnatural. It wasn't just the lantern's glow. Something else was happening. The pale green light pulsed as if it had a life of its own, and before they could react, it began to move. It wasn't just floating aimlessly. No, it drifted forward, weaving between the trees like a dancer in the dark, almost as if it were beckoning them, drawing them into the heart of the swamp. It moved with purpose, and its glow seemed to grow stronger with every passing second. Mike, ever the leader, took a step forward, determined to prove he wasn't afraid, even if every instinct in his body was screaming at him to turn back. He reached out, almost as if to touch the flickering light, but as his hand stretched out, the light danced away, just out of his reach. He frowned, confused but not willing to admit his fear. "We're fine. It's just a light," Mike said, his voice rough, though there was a tremor in it. He gestured for the others to follow. "Come on, it's probably just some weird swamp phenomenon. Let's get closer." But the others hesitated, a creeping dread settling in their chests. Sarah, normally the more cautious one, could feel her heart pounding in her ears. Every part of her wanted to turn back, to run, to get out of the swamp. She didn't care about the lantern or what was out there. She just wanted to leave. The air around them felt wrong, heavy and cold, like something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for them to make a mistake. "It's too quiet," Sarah muttered under her breath, clutching her flashlight tightly. "We should go back." But Mike ignored her, pushing ahead. He didn't want to be the one to show fear, especially in front of Josh, who was already looking at him with an expression of determination and unease. But it wasn't just Mike who felt it. They all felt it. There was something following them. Something watching them from the darkness just beyond the reach of their flashlights. They could sense it, like a presence just beyond their field of vision. Something ancient, something malicious. The trees around them seemed to grow even more twisted, their limbs reaching out like skeletal arms, scraping the air as they moved. The bark began to peel away in patches, revealing blackened, rotting flesh beneath. Some of the trees seemed to sway unnaturally, despite the lack of wind. The swamp, which had once seemed like a place of mystery, was now a place of oppression,
suffocating and dark. The ground beneath their feet was shifting, uneven and soft, and it felt as if the earth itself was trying to swallow them whole. Josh was the first to notice something truly strange. He had been walking behind Mike, his eyes scanning the darkness, when he saw a faint movement at the edge of the clearing. A figure standing motionless between two twisted trees, its form barely visible in the shadowed fog. His breath caught in his throat as he squinted, trying to make out what it was. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, just a shadow that was playing with their minds. But as Josh took another step forward, the figure came into sharper focus. It was a woman, her face pale and unnaturally smooth, with hollow, black pits where her eyes should have been. Her hair hung down in thick, tangled strands, resembling a nest of vines, twisting and writhing as though it had a mind of its own. The longer Josh looked, the more surreal and terrifying it became. Her form was almost transparent, like a ghost, but her presence was undeniable. She was real, and she was staring directly at them. Her lips moved, but there was no sound, no words, no whisper, just the eerie motion of her mouth, as if she were trying to speak, but couldn't. "Who the hell is that?" Mike asked, his voice cracking slightly as he stepped back. His hand instinctively reached for the lantern, but the light seemed dimmer now, as though it was losing its power. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching them, its black eyes unblinking, its pale face frozen in an eerie expression that sent chills through their spines. The air around them grew colder, and for the first time, they all felt the true weight of the swamp, of whatever presence was lurking there, watching them from the darkness. Josh's mouth went dry as his eyes locked onto the figure. He could feel his pulse in his throat and his body tensed, frozen in place. The woman's presence felt wrong, unnatural, like she was something that didn't belong in this world, something that had been trapped here, waiting for them to stumble into her domain. Suddenly, without warning, Josh screamed. The sound was sharp and piercing, cutting through the heavy silence of the swamp. "Josh!" Emily screamed, her voice filled with panic. She reached out for him, but he was already backing away, his face pale and contorted in horror. "What's wrong with you?" Josh couldn't tear his eyes away from the woman. He was shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His heart pounded in his chest like it was about to burst. The figure in front of them wasn't just standing there anymore. Her lips, which had moved soundlessly before, were now forming words. Horrible, unnatural words that echoed in their minds, sending waves of dread through their entire bodies. She's, Josh stammered, but he couldn't finish his sentence. His voice faltered, the words stuck in his throat.
Before anyone could react, the ground beneath them began to shake. It started as a low tremor, almost imperceptible at first, but it quickly grew stronger, the vibrations intensifying until it felt like the entire swamp was shaking with the force of an earthquake. The trees around them creaked and groaned as though they were being pulled from the earth, their branches swaying violently. The mist that had gathered around them thickened, swirling with an unnatural speed, turning the clearing into a suffocating cloud of fog. Then, the fog rolled in, faster, thicker, heavier, until it swallowed them whole, enveloping them in an inescapable shroud of darkness. The world around them went black. They could hear nothing now. No sound of the swamp, no rustling of the trees. Only the terrifying thrum of their own hearts pounding in their chests. Josh's scream echoed through the fog, a sound of raw terror. It wasn't just the fear of what they had seen, but the growing realization that they were no longer in control of what was happening. The swamp had taken on a life of its own, and it wasn't letting them go. The ground continued to tremble beneath them, the vibrations shaking their bones. It felt like the earth itself was waking up, angry and unforgiving. The fog pressed in, thick and suffocating, and it became harder and harder to breathe. Each breath felt like inhaling smoke, sharp and burning. The air tasted of something foul, like decay, like death itself had begun to settle over them. "Run!" Mike shouted, but his voice was barely audible over the roar of the tremors. He turned, but the fog was too thick. They couldn't see more than a few feet in front of them, and every direction seemed to lead into more darkness. The trees, once a source of shelter, now seemed to close in on them, their branches twisting and curling like claws, reaching for their throats. The figure was still there, watching them, even though they couldn't see her through the dense fog. But they could feel her presence, like an invisible hand gripping their hearts, squeezing tighter and tighter with every passing second. "We can't stay here!" Emily screamed, her voice cracking. She grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her forward, but it was no use. The fog had become a wall, trapping them in place, and the more they tried to move, the more the swamp seemed to fight back. Suddenly, a loud crack split the air, a sound like a branch snapping under the weight of something massive. The ground shook again, harder this time, and then the fog parted for just a brief moment, revealing the clearing once more. But it wasn't the same. The trees were twisted and bent, their trunks blackened and scarred. The ground was cracked and broken, and the air was filled with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. And there, standing at the edge of the clearing, was the woman. Her face was even paler than before, her eyes now glowing with an otherworldly light.
black and empty, staring directly into their souls. The figure in the distance began to move, but it wasn't like a person walking. It was different, almost unnatural. Her feet didn't touch the ground, her body suspended in mid-air as she floated silently towards them. The woman's presence was oppressive, suffocating the air around them. Her black eyes never left them, locking onto each one of them, piercing them with a cold intensity that sent shivers crawling up their spines. Mike was the first to react, his fight or flight instincts kicking in, even though every fiber of his body screamed for him to flee. "Run!" he shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. His legs moved before his brain could fully process the terror surging through him. But it was already too late. The woman's lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile as her gaze remained fixed on them. Without a word, she opened her mouth, and that was when the nightmare truly began. A sharp, hollow voice erupted from her, echoing across the clearing. It wasn't just the sound that was terrifying, but the way it seemed to fill the air, seeping into their bones. It was a voice that didn't belong in the world of the living. A voice from a place of darkness, twisted and hollow. "You have awakened the curse of the Black Lantern," she said. Each word coated in malice and ancient power. Her voice seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath their feet, making their teeth rattle. "Now you will join me in the swamp." The ground beneath them trembled, and the swamp around them seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. The trees began to shake, their twisted branches groaning like something alive, as if they were reaching out to grab hold of the intruders in their domain. The fog thickened again, swirling around them, and for a brief moment, it felt like the entire world had closed in on them. Josh instinctively reached for Emily, trying to pull her away from the horrifying scene. But she stood frozen, her body locked in place as her wide eyes stared at the woman, who was now so close she could almost feel the coldness radiating from her. Her feet wouldn't move, her mind paralyzed by fear, a fear so deep it seemed to transcend logic. Her breath was shallow, her chest rising and falling in quick, panicked bursts. But she couldn't escape. She was trapped in place by the weight of the woman's presence, a force too powerful to fight. "Emily, come on!" Josh's voice was strained, his grip on her arm tightening as he tried desperately to pull her away. But her body didn't respond. It was as though the fear had cemented her to the spot. Her gaze was still locked onto the woman, her breath coming faster now, but no words came from her mouth. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. It was as if the woman's very presence had wrapped itself around her, suffocating her will to escape. The woman's eyes never wavered from theirs, her smile widening, and then she spoke again, her voice growing louder, more insistent, a cacophony of dread that seemed to echo within their minds. "You will never leave," she hissed. "You are mine forever."
The words hit them like a physical blow, a weight that seemed to press down on their chests. The air thickened, suffocating them. The swamp, once just an eerie landscape, now felt like a living, breathing thing, as though it had risen to claim them as its own. The trees surrounding them were no longer just trees. They were twisted, gnarled creatures with eyes of their own, watching and waiting, as if they too had a part in the curse that had been set into motion. The coldness in the air intensified, as if the temperature had dropped to the point where they could see their breath misting in front of them. It was no longer just a chill. It was the chill of something older than time itself, something ancient, something that had been waiting for them in the dark. And now it was awake, and it was hungry. Josh turned to Mike, who was still standing there, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. Mike, usually the one to take charge in moments of crisis, was as paralyzed as the rest of them. It was as though the woman's curse had woven its tendrils into their souls, chaining them in place. The sense of helplessness that washed over them was overwhelming. No matter how hard they tried, they could feel it. They couldn't escape. The woman raised her arms slowly. At first, it was just a crack, a slight movement in the earth beneath their feet, almost imperceptible. But then the ground began to rumble, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through their bones. The crack widened, and before they could even react, the earth beneath them broke apart completely. The world tilted, and the ground began to crumble away, pulling them into the depths. "Help!" Emily screamed, her voice high-pitched and desperate. But the words were lost in the roar of the earth breaking apart beneath them. Josh tried to grab hold of anything, reaching for the trees, but the roots ripped free from the soil, as if they, too, were part of the cursed force that was consuming them. The woman's laughter echoed through the air, hollow and cold, as the ground swallowed them whole. They fell. There was no other word for it. They were dragged down into the depths of the swamp, their bodies twisting in the air as the earth consumed them. The feeling of weightlessness lasted only for a moment, and then, with a sickening thud, they crashed into the swamp's murky waters, their bodies sinking into the cold, black muck. The water felt like tar, thick and heavy, and it clung to them, dragging them down, making every movement feel like they were trying to break free from a nightmare. The black lantern, still glowing with its eerie pulse, floated just above the surface of the water, its dim glow illuminating the dark waters around them. It was the only light in the suffocating dark, its pulse matching the beating of their hearts as if it too was alive. Mike struggled to swim, but the weight of the muck was overwhelming.
His limbs felt heavy, as though they were moving through syrup. He tried to call out, but the water choked him, filling his mouth with the thick, foul liquid. He gasped for air, but there was none to be found. The swamp was closing in, drowning them in its cold embrace. "We're going to die here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking louder would make the nightmare more real. The words echoed in their minds, a cruel reminder of the fate that had already been sealed. The swamp had taken them, and there was no escape, no way out. The curse was real. They were its victims. And then, from the darkness beneath the water, they felt it. A presence, cold and dark, brushing against them as the water swallowed them whole. As the darkness closed in, they realized that the swamp wasn't just a place. It was a prison. A prison that had been waiting for them. When Mike, Sarah, Josh, and Emily regained consciousness, they were no longer in the swamp. At least, it didn't feel like the swamp they had left behind. The moment they opened their eyes, the first thing they noticed was the heavy silence that pressed down on them, much deeper and more suffocating than the eerie quiet they had felt before. The air was thick with a sense of wrongness, a palpable unease that crawled under their skin. The ground beneath them felt strange, too, like it was alive. The familiar squish of mud was absent, replaced by something hard, cold, and unyielding. It was as though they were standing on the bones of the land, a place that had long been forgotten. The trees around them had been transformed into something twisted, grotesque. Where once there had been the usual dark, towering figures of swamp cypress and moss-covered oaks, now there were blackened, skeletal remains of trees that seemed to stretch unnaturally toward the sky. The branches twisted like claws, reaching out for them with an insatiable hunger. Their bark had turned a sickly shade of gray, peeling away to reveal jagged scars beneath. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the same fetid scent that had once clung to the air before. But it was sharper now, more pungent. It felt as though the swamp itself had died and was now decaying at an accelerated rate. The ground was cracked, veins of dark, ashen earth running like rivers across a dead landscape. And the sky was the most unnatural part of all. Instead of the inky blackness of the night, it was an unsettling shade of red, like the sun had never set, like a permanent twilight had settled over the world. The clouds were swirling in a slow, methodical pattern, like the sky was alive, breathing and pulsing with a menacing energy that made their skin crawl. The light from the red sky barely illuminated the land, casting everything in a harsh
sickly glow that seemed to distort the shapes around them. Sarah, her head still spinning from the fall, slowly sat up, her eyes wide, as she took in the strange, nightmarish landscape around them. Her fingers curled into the dry, cracked earth, and her breath came in shallow gasps as she struggled to make sense of what was happening. We're not dead?" she asked, her voice. Josh, who was sitting beside her, looked around with the same confused expression. He could feel the weight of the place pressing down on him, suffocating him. He didn't feel alive, but he didn't feel dead either. He didn't know how to explain it, but there was a hollowness inside him, a gnawing emptiness. "No," Josh replied, his voice distant. He couldn't look Sarah in the eyes, the dread he felt too powerful to mask. "But we're not alive either." His voice cracked, and for the first time, he realized that he didn't know what they were. Emily, still disoriented, managed to push herself to her feet. Her knees were weak, and it took her a moment to steady herself. When she finally looked up, her eyes scanned the bleak, twisted landscape. This was no longer the swamp they had known. It was a warped, decayed version of it. A place that had been trapped in time, existing between two worlds, neither here nor there. The unnatural red sky made it feel like the sun had bled out of the world, leaving only this sickly, glowing afterimage. Where are we?" Mike's voice was hoarse, and his words seemed to disappear into the thick, oppressive air. The weight of it all was unbearable. He turned around in circles, as if trying to find something familiar, something that could give him hope. But there was nothing. The swamp had swallowed them whole, and now they were in this place. They tried to move, to take a step forward, but the ground held them in place, like it had grown roots into their very souls. It wasn't just the physical resistance, the way their feet stuck to the earth. It was something deeper, something inside them that kept them rooted to the spot. Every attempt to break free was met with resistance, like an invisible force pulling them down. They could feel the ground tightening around their legs, as if the earth itself were alive and it had recognized them. They were part of it now. As they struggled, the air around them began to hum with a low, vibrating energy. It started as a soft whisper, a sound so faint that they almost didn't hear it, but it grew louder, echoing through the stillness. The whispering was not from the trees, nor the wind, nor any creature of the swamp. It was something else entirely, a presence that seemed to come from the very air itself, from the earth beneath them. It was the same voice they had heard before, the voice that had haunted them in their darkest moments, the voice that had warned them, threatened them. This time, however, the voice felt closer, more insistent. It was all around them, filling the space like a poison that seeped into their minds. "The curse is yours now," the voice rasped, slow and deliberate, as though savoring the moment. The words wrapped around them like chains, tightening with every passing second. "You cannot leave. You are part of the swamp. The Black Lantern has claimed you." The words seemed to linger in the air like the stench of decay, refusing to dissipate. Their bodies tensed in unison as they tried to break free of the unseen force that held them in place. Their legs felt heavy, rooted to the ground, as if the swamp itself had claimed them, just as the voice had said. The weight of it was too much to bear, the realization too overwhelming. They had made a mistake. They had awakened something ancient, something that had been lying dormant for centuries, waiting for the right moment to claim them. And now that moment had come. Mike, his hands clenched into fists, tried to push himself free from the earth. But the more he struggled, the more the swamp seemed to pull at him. It was as if the ground was alive, sucking him in, feeding on his fear and desperation. His heartbeat thudded in his chest, and sweat beaded on his forehead. But no matter how hard he tried to move, it was like he was anchored in place by invisible chains.
God, this can't be real, Mike muttered, his voice a whisper. This isn't happening. He shut his eyes, trying to block out the vision of the twisted landscape. Didn't help. The sickly red sky burned through his eyelids, and the trees, those ghastly, skeletal remains, continued to reach toward him. "It's real," Josh said, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth. He turned to face the others, his eyes wide with terror, but there was no escaping it now. "We were meant walking somewhere. We're trapped. This place, this isn't the swamp. This is where the curse lives. This is where the Black Lantern keeps its victims." The words hung in the air, impossible to ignore. The Black Lantern wasn't just an object. It was a key to this place, to the curse that had been lying dormant, waiting for them to awaken it. And now, they were part of it. Part of the swamp, part of the curse. A cold breeze swept through the clearing, and for a brief moment, the whispering stopped. But the silence that followed was even worse than the voice itself. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. Waiting for them to accept their fate. "We can't stay here," Emily said, her voice breaking through the suffocating silence. Her eyes were wide with panic as she tried to pull herself free from the grip of the swamp. But it was hopeless. They were rooted to the ground. "We have to leave. We can't be trapped here. We can't be a part of this." Josh shook his head slowly, his face pale and drawn. "We can't leave. The swamp won't let us. We've been marked. We've become part of this place now. The curse, it's ours." The words echoed in their minds, the weight of them settling like a stone in their stomachs. There was no escape from this place. They were trapped, caught in a version of the swamp that existed outside of time, outside of reality. The Black Lantern had claimed them, and now they would never leave. For a long moment, they all stood there, unable to move, unable to speak. The heavy silence of the swamp enveloped them, pressing down on them, making every breath feel like a struggle. The trees loomed over them, their twisted branches reaching down like skeletal fingers. The ground seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, vibrating beneath their feet. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering began again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. "You belong to the swamp now," the voice said, the words filling their minds, their hearts, their very souls. "You will never leave. You are mine forever." The curse was complete. The Black Lantern had claimed them, and they were now part of the swamp. There was no turning back. They had crossed the point of no return. Days passed, or was it years? Time in the cursed swamp had lost all meaning. The oppressive atmosphere of the twisted, decayed landscape seemed to distort the very fabric of time itself. It was as though the swamp existed outside of the world they had known, outside of the rules of reality. The world around them, dark and endless, seemed to shift, morphing, pulsating with an eerie energy. It was impossible to measure the passing of time here. It was as if they were trapped in an endless, unrelenting moment that never ended. They had no way of knowing how long they had been here. The sky remained that unnatural shade of blood red, an endless twilight that stretched on forever. The air was thick, weighed down with the stench of decay, of ancient things that had rotted and withered long before their arrival. The trees around them had twisted into grotesque shapes, their blackened trunks reaching up like skeletal hands, stretching toward a sky that never changed. The fog, thick and suffocating, clung to the ground like a heavy blanket, making every movement feel slow, laborious, and futile. The whole place felt like a nightmare, a place where the living and the dead had fused together in a grotesque symbiosis, and there was no telling which was which. Mike, Sarah, Josh, and Emily had stopped trying to escape. They no longer even discussed it. They knew the truth now. They were bound to this place, cursed by the Black Lantern and the woman who had claimed them. The swamp had taken them, and there was no going back. They were trapped, not just in this nightmarish landscape, but in something far worse. They were trapped in the curse itself. It had wrapped itself around their souls, and the more they tried to fight it, the deeper it dug into them, claiming them more completely with each passing moment. It wasn't just the swamp that had changed them. It was the curse. They were no longer the people they had once been.
Their bodies were changing, slowly at first, but now it was undeniable. The blackened trees that surrounded them had begun to reflect in their own forms. Their skin had become darker, ashen, like the bark of the trees that now seemed to loom over them, growing twisted and gnarled, as if nature itself was punishing them for their trespasses. It felt as though their bodies were decaying, their flesh slowly transforming into something not quite human, something twisted and unnatural, something that belonged to the swamp. Their limbs had become... Josh, who had once been the most energetic of them all, now stumbled as he walked, his steps slow and labored. His once vibrant eyes had turned dull and hollow, reflecting the same despair that hung in the air. The swamp had taken its toll on him, on all of them. His thoughts were clouded, heavy with the sense of hopelessness that had become their only constant companion. His hands were stained black, his fingers stiff and brittle, as if the life in him had been drained, leaving nothing but a hollow shell. He could barely remember the person he used to be, the person who had laughed and joked with his friends, the person who had dared to explore the cursed swamp in the first place. That person felt like a distant memory, a faded dream. Sarah, too, had changed. Her once bright eyes had dulled, and her skin had become pale, almost translucent. Her body trembled constantly, not from fear, but from the weight of the curse that had settled deep within her. She could feel it, a gnawing emptiness inside her, spreading like a cancer. It wasn't just her body that had changed. It was her soul, her very essence. The curse had woven itself into the deepest parts of her being, and now all she could think of was the unshakable feeling that there was no way out, no escape from what they had become. Mike, who had always been the brave one, the one who had led them into this nightmare, now stood silently in the midst of the swamp. His gaze distant, his face expressionless. His once strong, broad shoulders had become hunched, weighed down by the same burden that had crushed them all. His eyes, once full of determination and courage, now seemed empty, lost. He no longer looked like the man who had once told jokes and comforted his friends in the face of danger. He was just another lost soul in the cursed swamp, a shadow of the person he had once been. Emily, the quiet one, the one who had been so hesitant to join the others in the first place, was now a mere whisper of herself. Her once delicate features had become sharp and twisted, her skin stretched tight over bones that felt too fragile for her frame.
Her voice, which had once carried with a soft, melodic tone, now cracked and trembled with every word. She had seen the truth, and she had accepted it, perhaps more easily than the others. She had seen what they had become, and now she knew there was no hope for them. The curse was theirs, and it would claim them completely.
The worst part was that they all knew there was no way out. No matter how hard they tried to fight, the swamp had them. The Black Lantern had claimed them, and now they were part of it. Part of the curse that had been set in motion the moment they had discovered it. The woman who had haunted them, the one who had warned them, had done so for a reason. They were trapped. There was no escaping it. The swamp was their prison, and the curse was their sentence. But there was one final, desperate option. It was the only thing that could give them a chance at freedom. They had all thought about it. They had all considered it in the dark moments when the despair became too much to bear. It was the only way to break free, but it came at a terrible cost. The Black Lantern had claimed them, but there was a way to pass the curse on, to pass it to someone else, to find someone else foolish enough to take the lantern. It would mean their freedom, but it would also mean the death of another soul bound to the lantern, bound to the swamp, just as they had been. They had become part of the curse, and now they had the power to drag someone else into it. But who could they find? Who would be foolish enough to take the lantern from them? They couldn't do it to another person, could they? They couldn't bring someone else into this nightmare, couldn't condemn another soul to the same fate they had suffered. But the longer they stayed, the more they changed, the more they became part of the swamp. They were running out of time. Josh looked around at the others, their faces twisted with the same hopelessness he felt. The curse had consumed them, and there was nothing left. Nothing but the Black Lantern and the woman who had trapped them here. The temptation of freedom was too great to ignore, but the cost would be too much to bear. Who do we find? Mike asked quietly, his voice barely a whisper. He was asking the question they had all been avoiding. The question that had been in their minds for days, weeks. How long had it been? It felt like an eternity. Who could we bring into this hell? Sarah closed her eyes, her heart heavy. She had considered it too. She knew it was the only way. They couldn't stay here. But the thought of passing the curse on, of condemning someone else to this fate, it felt like a betrayal, like they were becoming part of the evil that had trapped them. I can't, Sarah whispered, shaking her head. I can't do that. I can't bring someone else here. Josh nodded slowly. Neither can I, but we don't have a choice. Emily, standing a few paces away, looked up, her eyes hollow, her voice barely audible. Maybe we can't stop it, but we have to try. Someone has to break free.
The silence that followed hung heavy in the air. They all knew it was true. They had become part of the swamp. The curse was theirs to bear now. But if they didn't act, if they didn't pass the curse on, they would never leave. They would become twisted and broken, like the trees that surrounded them, forever trapped in the dark, suffocating embrace of the Black Lantern. And so they made their decision. It was the hardest decision they had ever made, but in the end, it was the only one they had left. They would find someone to carry the curse. It was the only way to break free, but it came at the ultimate price. Their freedom at the cost of another's soul.
The Black Lantern had claimed them, and now it was time for someone else to take their place.